very, very honored today to welcome distinguished alumnus Chuck Geschke. He got his PhD from CMU in computer science. His undergraduate degrees are in math and in Latin from Xavier University. And as he told me earlier this morning, he was amazed that Alumni was willing to take a bet on a Latin, was it Perlis? That Perlis was willing to take a bet on a Latin scholar. But it's clear that the bet paid off. Chuck co-founded Adobe in 1982. Adobe has been a leader and continues to be a leader in the field of software for more than 35 years now. Chuck and his co-founder, John Warnock, stepped off as the day-to-day leaders of Adobe in 2000, but they continue to share the chairmanship of the board. I was telling Chuck earlier that we have these days such an entrepreneurial culture among undergraduates at CMU that this was going to be an instance for students to hear how Chuck did this. And Chuck said, well, it's kind of impossible. No one's going to be able to do this. And I thought, because no one's you? No. Because times have changed, and the situation that allowed them to start Adobe and allowed them to be a success by the end of their very first year is not the kind of thing we find today. However, the story of the passion and the persistence and the vision that Chuck brought to the family of Adobe is certainly something that you can learn from. When we were talking earlier about how companies and how university departments go from a startup phase to a sustainable phase, Chuck was explaining that one of the reasons that Adobe has been so successful is that they allow people to be who they are. And they think of three kinds of people in a company. They think of the arrow shooters who can hit a particular target, the scouts who see how to get there, and the road builders who make sure that everybody does get to that particular place. But what Chuck explained was, by the time they started Adobe, what was remaining to do was to build that road. And that's because Chuck and John did an extraordinary job at being both scout and arrow shooter, at finding a target that nobody else had even dreamed existed out there, and then inspiring other people to move towards that target. Adobe was not all that long ago judged to be one of the most admired American companies by Fortune magazine. In fact, ranked #1 in the category of computer software of most admired American companies. And Chuck said that they did not have a complicated philosophy of what it meant to be an Adobe employee. There wasn't a 400-page handbook. There was one page of values. So join me in welcoming Chuck as he tells us what those values are and how Adobe came to be started, what its story is.
First of all, can you hear me in the back? Good. Second of all, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Now my job is to live up to it, which is always a challenge. So I did not come here today to sort of speak to you about a commercial for Adobe or give you necessarily a biography of myself. But the one advantage of getting old is that if you have any memory left at all, you sort of remember how you got to where you are. And I always think that that's sometimes helpful for young people like yourselves to at least have an idea of how one story worked its way from its concepts through its fruition. And I do remember sitting in a place like this, not nearly as nice as this building, by the way, but in a place like this at CMU in 1968. And sitting there wondering, would I ever be able to get my PhD from an institution of this quality and this level? And fortunately, I fooled them and I got out. So that was good. I do want to talk about my experience in founding a Silicon Valley startup and share with you not only some of the lessons that I learned, but a little bit about some of the mistakes that can occur along the way. And I'm going to use the example of Adobe, because it's the thing I know the best, as a way to talk to you about what it means to start a business. But the fact that I'm using Adobe at the example, don't focus too much on that. Focus on the sort of lessons that we learned along the way. And I'll give you some anecdotal evidence as well of why building a set of principles for the company or the computer science department or whatever it is that you build in your life is so critical to its long-term success. So I'm going to talk about the steps it took to get to startup, how a kid who was the first in his family to go to college could manage to get all the way through a degree in classics and somehow start a computer company. Secondly, the fact that it has turned out to be successful when the batting average is less than 5%. And some of it is timing, a lot of it is luck, and there, of course, is also some hard work as well. And in particular, it's always interesting, and as you think about companies and you hear about them, it's always informative to figure out how they get through the bad times. It's very easy to talk about the good times. Everybody loves to talk about that. But how you experience the tough times, and I'll have some things to say about that. And I'll finish with a few comments on some of the things that keep me up at night relative to technology and where we are in this country. Well, I grew up not too far away, about 150 miles northeast of here in Cleveland, Ohio. I went to a private Jesuit high school. I say private, it really was parochial, supported by the Jesuits. And then I went on to a Jesuit university, Xavier. And as I've already said and you've heard, my undergraduate degree was in classics. I was intrigued by the liberal arts. I always thought that it was important to have a broad education, even though I came from a family in which no one else had the opportunity to go to college. But I took a lot of mathematics because I figured eventually I'd have to figure out something to do. And based on finishing my master's degree in mathematics there, I got a job teaching at John Carroll University, which is also in Cleveland. And while I was teaching, I was working on my doctorate at Case Western Reserve. After about 2 or 3 years of teaching, we had a faculty meeting, and we decided one of our graduate students wasn't going to make it. And so somebody had to tell him this. We drew straws, and of course I got the short straw. And so I brought him into my office. I did my very best not to defeat his feeling of self-worth, but I did tell him he was going to have to leave and find something else to do. About a year later, he called me, and he wanted to come back and visit me in my office. And I thought, well, I said yes, but I said, boy, this could be awkward depending on how the last year has gone for him. But he came by, big grin when he walked into my office, said, you know, the best thing you ever did for me is kick me out of here. He said, I got this job selling computers for General Electric, and I've made so much money in the last year that I just had to come back and thank you. And I've been trying to think of how I could show my gratitude. And it occurred to me, if perhaps you would like to learn how to program a computer. I said, yeah, I'd love to. He said, fine, I'll come back in the evenings during the summer and teach you how to program. So he did, and I wrote some programs in Fortran on a small computer. The only program that I remember actually finishing was a program to print out those addressable envelopes for the announcement of my daughter's birth, our second child. Not a strong background in computer science, I would say, at that point. But unbeknownst to me, there was this program going on with the US government called ARPA. And ARPA was really a fallout of the Sputnik event back in 1957. And the decision was that we had to start getting serious about funding more basic research in the area of space exploration and defenses against people who might get to space before us. During the transition from the Eisenhower administration to Kennedy, I took Kennedy aside and said, I've been told by some advisors I really respect in the Department of Defense that we cannot depend in the long run on analog communications to run a worldwide military. I've been told that we have to convert to digital communications, and I think it's important that you take that advice seriously. This is Ike speaking to JFK. Now, my assumption is that neither one of those politicians knew what that sentence meant, which was fine. But Kennedy took it seriously, and he decided, the guy who's got the biggest budget in my cabinet, and the fellow who is sort of most technical from his background at Ford Motor, is named McNamara. I'll give him the job. So he told McNamara he wanted him to figure out what to do. McNamara, in turn, knew a lot of people at MIT, and in particular was introduced to a man by the name of J.C.R. Licklider, who was actually not an electrical engineer or dealing directly himself with any research in computers. His PhD was in psychoacoustics. But he was a remarkable guy, and so what McNamara said is, I'm going to give you a few tens of millions of dollars, and I want you to figure out not just how to do some research so if Congress ever asks a question we can defend ourselves, but more importantly, I want you to train a whole new cadre of people who can become experienced in electronics, electrical engineering, and the term computer science didn't exist at that time, but in basically computer science. Well, Licklider decided he would not do an NSF-like program where you give a lot of people a very little amount of money. Instead, he was going to give 30 to 40 times a typical NSF grant to a few centers of excellence. And he would select those centers of excellence by the quality of the people who had leadership positions in those organizations. A few of them were industrial research labs like RAND, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman in Boston, MITRE Corporation, Stanford Research Institute out in Menlo Park, but most of them were universities. And he started out with about a dozen, plus or minus a little. Stanford, Cal, UCLA, Caltech, University of Utah, University of Michigan, the University of Illinois, Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Tech, of course, in those days, and Harvard, MIT, and there may have been one or two others. And he went to each of them. He selected the principal scientists who were going to run, in effect, those organizations. And here at Carnegie Tech, he picked, of course, the great triumvirate of Perlis, Simon, and Newell. And they were the ARPA contractors. He said, I'm not going to micromanage you. I'll come by a few times a year, sort of check in, see how things are going. You won't have to write an awful lot of reports, but you'll have to do whatever's necessary to make sure that Congress, if they check, are content that we're doing this correctly. But he said, most importantly, I want you to take a significant portion of the funds and educate graduate students. Obviously, this was in the universities, not the private labs. And he said, secondly, I also want you to be responsible for doing as broad a horizontal communication within this community of institutions as is possible. And in fact, I'm going to demand that you do that on a regular basis, and that you don't think of the research you do as something you own. You think of it as something that's being contributed to this pool of research. And based on that, almost all of the senior management in Silicon Valley were educated as ARPA brats. I was an ARPA brat. Everyone who was a graduate student in CMU, if they didn't have an independent scholarship, had an ARPA scholarship. And that's really how Silicon Valley was developed. It was an incredible program. It was done in a very unique way. And I often wonder what the world of alternative energy would be like had we done a similar program in the research areas around that. But that's a whole other conversation. At any rate, so I showed up at the door. Alan Perlis said, fine, you got 2 kids, you'll get $350 a month instead of $300. And in 1968, you could survive on that. And so my wife, who had noticed that I was becoming more interested in computers than I was in my mathematics, which I was about to start my thesis in, And I said, you know, you really sure you want to do this? And she said, Chuck, I want you to follow your dream because that will make you successful. Best advice you could ever possibly get. And I did follow my dream. 4 years later, I got out. By then, we had 3 kids. Not exactly planned, but that's the way it worked out. In 1972, I had to get a job. Of course, my thesis advisor, and I was very fortunate, Bill Wolf was my thesis advisor. Many or most of you probably either know him or of him. And he picked me, and I was grateful he did because he was brand new. It was his first year on the faculty, and I knew that any entering professor had to get some students graduated, and I figured if I could catch his coattails, I could get out of here too. But at any rate, when I finished, I decided I did not want to go on in teaching. I wanted to go work in an industrial research lab, and I got a job offer to come to Xerox PARC. And Xerox PARC was a magical place. Now, the reason Xerox PARC existed was that Peter McCullough, the chairman of the board, and David Kearns, the president of Xerox, had an incredibly successful company, but it only had one product, the copier. And they knew instinctively, as anyone knows in business, you can't be a single product company and survive forever. You've got to diversify. They thought at first that they would put their resources into research and house it where the center of their development was in Rochester, New York. But they pretty quickly understood that the antibodies from the copier business would kill off any new research almost immediately. So they hired a fellow, George Paik, a physicist out of Washington University in St. Louis, and he ended up deciding to take a piece of property for lease in Silicon Valley at the Stanford Industrial Park. Very good idea that Stanford had developed that park in order to keep their graduates and some of their faculty in close proximity to the university. And in turn, he hired 2 people, Jerry Elkind from Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, and Bob Taylor, who was Licklider's successor at ARPA. And the reason those 2 hires were so critical is they knew where all the ARPA brats were. And they knew who were the most likely to be helpful and successful in getting a research program going, and they hired us. When I arrived in the fall of '72, in the office next to me was a guy named Bob Metcalf, who invented the Ethernet and built 3Com. A whole variety of people at Xerox PARC went on to do things that were quite incredible, both within the research lab, but elsewhere, unfortunately, afterwards. And I say unfortunately, because we all joined Xerox hoping to bring Xerox into the future. In fact, in 1976 in my office, I had a personal computer called the Alto. It had some interesting software on it, a text editing program called Bravo, which if you looked at it, you would think it was Microsoft Word, and it was, because the fellow who did it left and went to Xerox and built Office for Microsoft, Charles Simoni. It was on a network, the Ethernet. It was hooked up to a 60-page-a-minute black and white printer, a 10-page-a-minute color printer. It was hooked up to file servers where we could store information and share it. And as a subcontractor to ARPA, we were on the ARPANET. So we were sending electronic mail throughout the ARPA community as well as within Xerox Corporation, where eventually there were over 1,000 of these computers. 1976, many of you are too young to know this, the IBM PC did not get introduced till 1981, 5 years later. In 1977, I and 2 of my companions were given the job of putting on a demonstration to Xerox senior management of what the Office of the Future could look like. It was to be done at a meeting that Xerox held on a biannual basis of their top 250 managers worldwide. This time it was in Boca Raton, Florida. So we ended up leasing space on a couple of DC-10s. Personal computers were a little bigger in those days. And flew all the equipment and printers and everything down to Florida, set everything up. In the morning we put on a stage production, which was actually prototyped for us on a sound stage in Hollywood, of what the Office of the Future could look like. And then in the afternoon we ran a trade show. so that all of the Xerox executives, and because it was both business and social, also their wives, girlfriends, and by the way, I didn't say the Xerox executives and their husbands, because I think all 250 of those executives were men. This was the body language of a Xerox executive looking at what they saw in this walk-in exhibition. Scared to death is what this means. Hope it goes away soon. Hope I never have to deal with it. They were copier guys. That's what they understood. They didn't understand any of this computer stuff. Well, their wives and girlfriends had all worked in offices. So they sat down, they played with the mouse, they clicked on a button, out came a printed page. It looked the same as what was on the display. They said, wow, this is really cool. They were ultimately the customers, or at least the clients, of what this Office of the Future could provide. Well, the reaction of Xerox executives was not lost on us who were in research, and it was actually fairly depressing because it was clear it was going to be a real uphill battle to get Xerox to bring anything out. But when I got back to Palo Alto, I was given the opportunity to start up a new laboratory within the research center focused on graphics and printing. My first job was to go out and hire a sort of principal or chief scientist for that laboratory. And I had known by reputation a fellow by the name of John Warnock, who had gotten his PhD at the University of Utah, also an ARPA brat, and at the time was working in Mountain View, California for NASA Ames under contract from a Salt Lake company called Evans and Sutherland. I called him up, I said, let's have lunch. We had lunch. He had a beard, I had a beard. Still married to the same woman he married originally, so was I. He had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. I had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And we both refereed soccer, which closed the deal. So I hired him, and best hiring decision I made in my entire life. And John came to work, and we did a variety of different things, and then eventually we were approached by the, quote, product group, which never really succeeded, that was going to try and get some semblance of the Office of the Future out into the marketplace, and at the last minute they discovered that they couldn't print. Now, for Xerox not to be able to print would have been a real problem because they had a whole history of putting marks on paper. So they called us in and said, we need some help. We put together a sort of crash project to design a language that would allow you to take any application running on any computer, specify the description of what the printed page should look like, and send it to any printer of any resolution, of any characteristics, could be black and white, could be color, and it would print it. We called it Interpress. The Xerox management loved it. They said, we're going to standardize on this. And for a young laboratory that had only been open a couple years, this was a big deal. So I immediately got on an airplane and I flew back to Stamford, Connecticut, and I said, this is wonderful. When can we start marketing Interpress to the world? And they said, whoa, 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 wait a minute. At Xerox, it takes 7 years to bring out a product. Really? I said, 7 years? Yep. I said, well, so we can't talk about this? Nope, because if you do, the Japanese and other people will beat us to the market and take it away. And I said, well, 7 years is 2 to 3 generations in the industry that we're in, or going to be in. It'll be such old news by the time you bring out a product, it'll be worthless. Sorry, 7 years at Xerox. Well, that pushed me and John over the edge. And through his thesis advisor at the University of Utah, Dave Evans, we were introduced to a man by the name of Bill Hambrick, who was the founder of Hambrick & Quist, one of the very first venture firms out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And John and I said that we had an idea that we wanted to put together some computers, some laser printers, some plate making equipment, and a whole bunch of software so we could build a complete solution for in-house publishing and sell it into the Fortune 500. Turns out, unbeknownst to us, Bill hated financial printers, and he saw this as a way to put them out of business. So he said, okay, I like the idea, I'll support it, and you have to quit your jobs. We said, really? Yeah, you got to quit your jobs, and I will give you $2.5 million over 2 years to get started in building your idea, and turning it into a product. He said, oh, by the way, have either of you ever run a business? And we said, oh, no. He said, well, fine, I'll hire a guy to help you write the business plan so I can raise the money, but don't worry about that. So he did, hired a guy, wrote the business plan, approved it. We got our commitment to $2.5 million. It was actually in 2 payments, $1.25 million each year. We opened our doors, started hiring, and very early on, Gordon Bell called and wanted to come by and see what we were doing. Now, Gordon had been my hardware professor here at Carnegie Mellon, but at that point in his career, he was running research and development for digital equipment. So he comes by, he looks at what we're doing, he said, wow, this is very fascinating. He said, but I don't need computers, I'm DEC, and I got this deal with Ricoh for laser printers, so I don't need any laser printers. My problem is I've got 2 or 3 development teams trying to figure out how to interface the applications running on these computers to these printers, and they're getting nowhere. Why don't you just sell me that software that you've got? And we said, no, we have this business plan, raise $2.5 million. We can't do that. And he said, well, if you change your mind, give me a call. About 6 weeks later, a friend of ours who had left Xerox and went to work for Apple Computer and had the job of running the Macintosh development program brought Steve Jobs by. Steve looked at what we were doing, was very impressed by it. He said, I don't need computers. I got this thing, the Macintosh, that'll be out in another year. And I've got a deal with Canon for a laser printer, so I don't need a laser printer. Why don't you sell me your company and come work for Apple and provide me that software? And we said, no, Steve, we're starting our own business. We're not going to sell the company. He said, okay, well, I can sort of understand that. He said, all right, then how about we'll do a deal and you'll sell me the software? And we said, Steve, we have this business plan. He said, well, I think you guys are nuts. When you change your mind, call me. So we went and talked to the man who Bill Hambrick had put in charge of our board, the chairman of our board, who had been around forever. And he looked at us and he said, you guys are nuts. He said, forget the business plan. Throw out the damn business plan. He said, it was only there to raise money. Now you know what your customers want. Give it to them. So I go back and I call up Steve and I say, Steve, we've changed our mind. He says, great. What do you want for the company? I said, Steve, the company's not for sale. Okay, let's do a deal. So we did a deal with Apple right at the end of our first year in business, for which they gave us a prepayment on future royalties of about $1.5 million. And they bought 19.9% of the company. When you guys take your business courses, you'll know why it was 19.9%. It's so you don't have to consolidate earnings. And he paid 5 times what the original investors paid. So at the end of our first year, we had returned a multiple of 5 to our investors, and we were cash flow positive and had a profit. This never happens, okay? It doesn't happen. But it did happen to us, and obviously we've been eternally grateful for that, but we had this incredible opportunity now to begin building something that could really make our company move forward quickly. And what we did is we signed a contract to develop the original laser writer for Apple. And the laser writer was the first PostScript printer to come to market. It was introduced in January of 1985 to very positive technical acclaim. And the product began selling very well for Apple, and then all of a sudden the sales started to go like this. Well, the problem was that Apple at that time had decided that their marketing campaign was to sell the Macintosh Office. Problem was they weren't IBM. There was no way on either price or feet on the street that they could compete with IBM, and they were losing market share very rapidly to the PC. Fortunately, there was a marketing guy at Apple who did not believe in the Macintosh Office, but he knew about a company up in Seattle called Aldus that had a program called PageMaker, which did page layout on a Macintosh. He knew about PostScript and the laser printer, and together the 3 companies invented a brand new marketing campaign for ourselves and Apple called desktop publishing. And by the summer of, late summer, early fall of 1985, the sales of both the Macintosh and the LaserWriter started to take off again. In our first year of having actual revenue, we had $4 million in revenue. Then we went to 16 million, to 39 million, to 83 million, to 129 million. We were on a rocket ship. We had 3 stock splits during that period because we went public in the summer, in August of 1986. Our public offering was for $5.5 million. Nobody gasped. None of you guys are business guys? That's the trouble. You're all technical guys. By the way, when we started the company, I did read one business book. And I only remember one chapter in the book. And the chapter was Market Gap Analysis. And what it said was, if you're going to start a product or a business, look for a place in the marketplace where there's a need, but nobody has currently got a solution to fill that need. And do that, and then you'll have 100% market share, and shame on you if you can't keep most of it. Well, John and I thought that was a good idea. So that, in fact, has been the philosophy behind our business. But I also didn't realize that $5.5 million was really small. But we didn't need cash because we were profitable and cash positive. Our shareholders were quite happy because they were already able to begin to sell stock. So this rocket ship, okay, anything that goes up, in my experience, eventually comes down, at least as long as you have gravity. So by 1989, we were doing spectacularly well. And then all of a sudden, our biggest customer, Apple, and our biggest competitor, Microsoft, decided to get together and see if they could put us out of business. We had developed some type technology so that you could not only get high-quality typography on the printer, but also on the screen. Apple decided they were going to do their own thing, something called TrueType. Microsoft decided that this was an opportunity for a wedge because they had bought one of the 70 PostScript clone developers out of the marketplace, and they said, okay, Apple, we'll give you the clone so you don't have to pay Adobe any more royalties, and we'll take your typefaces and put them up on Windows, which will give you instant 100% market share in that business, and forget about Adobe. Well, that was very sobering. And when something like that happens, you sort of have to make a gut check and go back to the core principles that you had in mind when you started your business. The first principle that John and I agreed on immediately when we started Adobe is that we wanted to build a company that we personally would like to work for. We figured if we'd like to work for it, all the other nerds that we knew would like to work for it too. So that was principle number one. Second principle was that it was clear that we were a business that was built exclusively with intellectual capital. You know, we had no factories. We really didn't make anything. The fact that you had to distribute software on a disk was sort of an accident in those days. And we really had nothing other than what was in the heads of our employees and ourselves that was real capital or real ownership by the company of anything. We also had a principle that we would hire the very best people that we could find, independent of whether they're male or female, whatever their ethnic background was, whatever their cultural preferences were, didn't matter. Just so they were the best people that we could find for the jobs that we were trying to hire for. And in fact, I've always told our managers, hire people who are smarter than you. First of all, it's a larger population from which to choose. And, oh, glad you got that one. And secondly, if you hire people who are smarter than you, they'll take your job away and you'll have to get promoted. So it's the best way to develop your career. The other principle we had is that we wanted to build a company of inventors. Our job was to innovate and to build products that fulfill that market gap analysis that I mentioned a few moments ago. So if you look like a product or a technology like PostScript, there was nothing like that in the market in those days. You either had a dot matrix printer or a simulated typewriter that was run like a printer, nothing that could take raster and produced high-quality typography, line art, and photographs. Photoshop. When we introduced Photoshop, there were no digital cameras. The scanner was about the size of a refrigerator and cost $40,000 to $50,000. There were no inkjet printers that could produce high-quality prints in your home or in your office. Yet instinctively, we knew that if printing went digital, then photography and eventually video would have to. And so we went in there early, got 100% market share, tried to sell the idea to Kodak. Kodak said, no, we like yellow boxes. Yellow boxes are our future. Went to Japan, to Fuji. They said, very interesting. They took on the technology and they built some of the first digital cameras. Acrobat. When Acrobat came out, there was no internet. It came out about 3 or 4 years early. People sort of didn't have this concept of the electronic document, but it has ended up in resulting in trillions of pages out on the World Wide Web and pretty much on every person's computer. So that thing of thriving on innovation was critical. The other thing we instinctively knew and probably mostly learned is that to be a successful company, we had to manage 4 constituencies: our customers, our employees, our shareholders, and the communities in which we operated. And if you think about that for a moment, each of those constituencies is somewhat mildly, in some cases more violently, in opposition to one another. What's good for one is not good for the other. All right? Employees want to get paid a lot of money. Shareholders want you to turn in an unusually large profit. Those are not necessarily linked up. However, how you manage those constituencies and how you balance them so that each one of them thinks they're getting a fair deal is critical to your long-term success as a business. And finally, people would often ask us, well, you know, we're part of Adobe now, sort of how should we behave? Do you have a manual that tells us the rules of how you should be an Adobe employee? And we'd say, no, I have no intention of writing such a manual. We have one very simple principle, and that is, if you are a member of the Adobe family, you treat your employee, you treat your boss, you treat your customer, you treat your shareholder, you treat the people in the community in which you're running your business the way you'd like to be treated. If you do that, those people will be your allies. They will like you and like doing business with you. And that was the whole Adobe principle. Now, we didn't do this in a vacuum. We were trying our best to take the best parts of the HP tradition and sort of recodify them for our age and for our business. But how you treat people is so critical to the success of whether it's a business, a university, a nonprofit, doesn't matter what it is. So the real question is, with this threat now from Microsoft and Apple, is this really good business? Or is it Chuck just up there sort of talking motherhood and apple pie, you know, and doesn't really mean anything? Well, it so happens that the announcement of this unholy partnership between Apple and Microsoft occurred at a major conference in the publishing industry. It was called the Siebold Conference, put on by Jonathan Siebold. It was held a couple times a year, once on the West Coast, once on the East Coast. This one happened to be in San Francisco. And of course, the organizers of the conference love controversy like this. So they immediately added a new session on the last day of the conference in which there would be a panel discussion of, would you prefer to go with the direction that Apple and Microsoft are promising, or would you prefer to stick with Adobe? That wasn't the exact title, but that was the idea. Close enough. So the conference had about 1,500 attendees at the sessions. There was also a trade show that went on in parallel with it. And so the room was full. I stood in the back of the room saying, wonder what I'll be doing for my next career. And the moderator said, well, the first thing I want to do is take a straw poll. How many of you think it would be better if Apple and Microsoft got together and basically just took away Adobe's business and you went with them? Now, I can't tell you that there were no hands raised in the room. There were a few, but I think most of them were either Apple or Microsoft employees. And in fact, the whole tone of that discussion for an hour and a half was, of course not. Adobe is the leader in terms of opening up new technology. Their products work. We're happy with them. By this point, we were also shipping Illustrator. And they said, we want to stick with Adobe. Well, we had a second thing ready, and that is we had the technology for putting that typeface solution on both Macintoshes and PCs. We introduced it to the market about 60 days after this conference. It immediately began selling hundreds of thousands of units a month, and it took 3 years for Microsoft to finally get TrueType on the PC, so it became a non-issue after, did I say 3 months? I meant to say 3 years. 3 years to get that out, and it turns out that Apple never shipped a printer with the clone because it never worked. I believe that the reason those people voted that way was because of the way we treated them as a company. I think that was absolutely critical. There was one other time this happened, and I'll be very quick about this one. In 1998, John and I decided it was time to get ready to retire. We went outside the company to try and hire new management. It failed utterly. We fired all 4 of the potential new CEOs on the same day. That was followed by an announcement out of Japan that the market had cratered over there for computer software. All of a sudden, our expenses were well ahead of our earnings. We had to do a layoff, and we had to pre-announce a bad quarter. That's not a good combination of things to have to deal with. As a result, our one competitor in one market area that had actually taken the market away from Aldus and PageMaker was a company called Quark. Had a product called Express. Now, Quark was an interesting company. It was not a public company, but they had generated a lot of cash, and the guy who ran it was sort of an ornery fellow, and his customers did not like him. But they bought his product because the technology was very good, but he didn't treat them very fairly. They never got upgrades. They had to pay a whole new license for the thing, and it was just not dealt with as a nice company. Fortunately, this all happened once again in the fall at the time of the Seabold Conference. Once again, there was a panel. Quark, take over Adobe, Adobe, stay alone. Same results, except this time I think there wasn't a single hand raised in the audience because of the behavior of the CEO of Quark. And we were given an opportunity at that conference to show off InDesign, which was our answer to Quark. And it is the first and so far the only time we've ever gone into a market that someone had majority share. Today we have majority share and Quark is perilously close to being out of business. Once again, not motherhood and apple pie, just very good business. Let me conclude with a couple of things that sort of keep me up at night, and I'll cut this back a bit so we have time for questions. I already talked about ARPA and how I would really love to have seen ARPA do something ARPA-like to have been done by the government in the area of energy independence. So far it hasn't happened, not sure it ever will. But if they could do it in the way that Licklider organized ARPA in those early days, in particular the Information Projects Office within ARPA, it would be an incredible benefit to this country. A couple of statistics. Some of these are getting a little long in the tooth, but they're still relatively current. China and South Korea have both been increasing their investment in basic research at the rate of 10% a year. And they've been doing that for more than a decade. And I'll get to the US in a moment. It's pretty clear that unless we do something like that, we're going to begin to lose scientists in all fields, not just in computing. There was a recent survey that was done by Booz Allen back in the middle of the 2000s, and by the end of 2007, China and India had gone from 19% of the personnel in R&D to 31% of the world's percentage. That's pretty huge growth. In global R&D rankings, things look pretty good. The United States leads. We have 34% of the total money being spent in R&D worldwide. And if you throw Japan into the mix, that's more than 50% of the money spent. But that may not be the most meaningful statistic. I think a more meaningful one is how much of the R&D money do we spend as a percentage of our GDP? And how does that compare to other countries? Well, when you throw that in, things change. And now we rank 7th in R&D, and we're behind Sweden, Finland, Japan, Switzerland, Iceland, and South Korea. Not so good. Well, let's talk about basic research, because the D is sort of muddy because you're really building products. You may or may not be doing something that's incredibly innovative. Well, in basic research, global spending, we rank 11th as a country. If you take the defense, and that's as a percentage of GDP, so we rank 11th. If you take out defense research, we rank 22nd. Remember how we always say we're number one? As I look at data now, we're not number one in very many things. Maybe in debt, but not in other things. And that's not good. And the popular political theory is, well, business will pick up the gap. Business isn't picking up the gap. Business is getting rid of R&D. Not D, R, basic research. You know, Bell Labs, I assume there's still something that has roughly that name, but it's not the Bell Labs that I knew as a young person growing up. IBM Research has gotten much smaller. We just don't see much R. Now, of course, like anyone in Silicon Valley, my real nightmare, the thing that keeps me up, is 2 guys in a garage that I've never heard of. Because they could do something that could completely disrupt our business. And you see that happening on a regular basis. I mean, who knew that those 2 graduate students at Stanford would come up with the idea of Google? Or that guy at Harvard who was sort of, according to the movie, a little out of the social mainstream would come up with Facebook. I mean, that's amazing stuff and very disruptive to other businesses. I'll conclude by just a couple of comments on what I value from my experience. Obviously, I've had the great good fortune to not only be a co-founder of a successful company, and you do, if you own stock in a company like that, you find yourself having more money than you had expected. But that's not what an engineer dreams about. An engineer, a scientist, don't care which, dreams about coming up with something that millions of people will find valuable and use. That's what drives us. That's really what you want to do. That puts the stamp of importance on what you've achieved. And that's something that John and I and all the early people at Adobe have had the experience of, and it is by far the most gratifying thing. And it manifests itself in lots of different ways. You read statistics, you see other companies who are trying to get rid of it. You know, Steve gets up there and complains about Flash, but I know the reason has nothing to do with technology, it has to do with his business approach. But the other thing that happens when you have that impact, and this has happened to me many times over the last 20 plus years, is you encounter people who don't know who you are, they find out who you are, they stick out their hand and say, thank you, you made a difference in my life. It may have been starting a business, it may have been someone who wanted to be a graphic artist but didn't have the motor skills to be successful, but now that the computer had the motor skills, they could become successful. There are 10 times as many graphic designers today as there were when PostScript was first introduced to the market. And finally, I think I may have already mentioned this. I'm not sure. Sorry if I forget what I said. But my father and grandfather were letterpress photo engravers. Those are the people who made the copper plates that were used to do four-color printing. Started around the turn of the century and went through most of the 20th century until PostScript, which completely replaced that business in roughly a 10-year period. And when everything in printing now is fully electronic. Well, my dad fortunately lived to be almost 99 years old. And so after Adobe was founded, he was actually living with us. And I brought home one day some color halftones to show him. And I knew they weren't very good, but I just wanted to show him that we were starting to work in that area. And I showed it to him, and my father always had his engraving loop with him. Took the loop out, and he looked and looked. Looked up at me, no smile on his face. He said, "Charles," he only called me Charles when there was a problem. "Charles, that doesn't look very good." I said, "I know, Dad, I know. But we're making progress rapidly. I assure you we will eventually have something that you will say is good." "Okay, I hope so." About a year, well, no, it wasn't even that long, maybe 9 months later, I knew we had made the breakthroughs and that our halftones now were, in fact, better than most of the mechanical halftones that were produced. So I brought a sample home and I said, "Hey, Dad, take a look at this." And he took out his loop and he looked a third time, looked again. Big grin on his face. He said, "Charlie, you've finally done it." And to me, that was the most important thing that came out of my experience in starting Adobe. Thanks a lot, and I'll be delighted to take your questions. Come on, I was sitting out there not too long ago.
When you left Xerox and formed Adobe, you were working on follow-ons to what you've been doing at Xerox.
Right.
Was there a problem with that? Did Xerox think they owned that?
Xerox was concerned about that after they saw what we were doing, but we had checked very carefully with intellectual property attorneys. We didn't take anything that we had done at Xerox with us, except the idea that was in our head. And that, fortunately, you can't copyright or trademark someone else's head.
Doesn't stop them from trying.
No, I know. But no, and it was very harmonious. And our biggest PostScript customer today is Xerox. And the market capitalization of Adobe is bigger than Xerox's. Interesting world we live in. Other questions? God, you people are shy. Yeah.
In the beginning, you said that you couldn't have formed Adobe today, or like, I don't remember what's the exact phrase. Why is that?
That was a little stronger than I might have put it. I think it's the way in which we started Adobe. First of all, today, you've got to really work hard to make sure the venture capitalists don't give you too much money, ironically, even though that's now changed a bit since 2008, but it's still there. And what I mean by that is they want to own a significant piece of what you're doing, and the problem with that is that then they want to sort of take control of how you do it. That was something that Bill Hambrick at Hambrick and Chris was great about, and he was on our board after we, as a startup company, and he was very good about the fact that they would not. He was sort of Licklider-like. He would not micromanage us. He wanted to know where we were headed, and he wanted us to come to that board when we needed help or advice about what to do. But he really gave us our head. That sometimes is very hard to do today. The best venture capitalists still do it that way, but some don't. The second thing is that we were coming into a market in which there weren't a lot of entrenched positions. You know, yeah, Microsoft was there, but they weren't selling Windows yet. And so they weren't nearly as big a force. In fact, Bill Gates was at the introduction of the laser writer and sat next to him because they wanted to bring out their Office product on the Mac so that they could take advantage of the Mac's market. Very different than the world is today. So we didn't have that kind of entrenched position, and we were able to find pretty simply a market gap into which we could move, and the gap was huge. That's the other important ingredient. Today, that's, again, a lot harder to do. And the third thing that's harder to do today is to go public. You see that many of the startup companies end up not being able or deciding not to go public, and they get bought out by someone else. Not all of them, but we were able to go public, as I said, on an offering of $5.5 million. And today, you'd have to be a multi-billion-dollar valuation before any investment bank would look at you. In those days, our market cap after we went public was $55 million. Nobody touched that today. So there are those kind of differences. I'll tell you the one other thing that might be different, and it's another thing that keeps me up at night. I saw recently, about 2 weeks ago, a chart of the number of students completing degrees at all levels in computer science. It's now significantly lower than the number was in 1982. This is in the US. That's scary. Scary for our industry. And you know, fortunately, there are a lot of great students coming out of India and China, but it's hard to get them sometimes to either come to or stay in the United States because their world is getting better in their own domestic markets, and that's a problem. We are falling way behind in terms of the manpower necessary to maintain our position in the world, and that's scary. Yeah.
Well, schools of computer science, which was a department, but
I'm sorry?
both the then department, now School of Computer Science, and Adobe have gotten orders of magnitude larger than they were originally. Can you speak to the challenges of retaining the culture and principles that make them both special places when at the beginning most of the people that know each other, and once they scale up, that's only social cohesion much lower?
Well, as we started our company, we hired people that we already knew, and we hired people who were finishers. Nolan Bushnell has a great quote. He said, "Everyone who's ever taken a shower has had a great idea. But we know that if you want to be successful, you got to finish that idea and get it to market." So, and through that network, the network continued to build, and we hired people that we knew. Clearly, that's not possible at our current size. We have about 9,000 employees, about 1,500 of them are in India. It's a very different world. What we do, though, what the company does, and the management that we recruited to replace us does, is continually reinforce those ideas because they too have experienced that that's good business. And when we tried to go outside and bring in people, it immediately became apparent that finding someone who wasn't part of the growth story of Adobe never quite understood why that particular culture was so important. So the man who replaced John and myself was a fellow from the inside, Bruce Chizen, who had run our sort of consumer products area. The next replacement, under Shantanu Narayan, has been with Adobe for about 15 years, I guess, by now. And he's also, of course, from inside, and he's doing an incredible job, and we've been very fortunate. The other lesson you learn is you look at what happens at other companies, and even a great company like Hewlett-Packard has gone through some very difficult times in terms of maintaining its position and its culture. And we're going to fight it as long as we're around, and hopefully people will see the value in it and continue to do that after we're no longer involved. Yeah.
So you mentioned about the time that you released Photoshop and Acrobat into the market. And it sounded like it was too early in the market.
It was what?
It was too early in the market because the market was not ready. How did you decide those kind of?
Well, again, you don't want to be second. That's the critical point I was trying to make. And the second thing is you have to be prepared to fight for that number one position, not just outside, but inside. So when we introduced Photoshop, all the people who were making all the profit and all the money in PostScript said, why the hell are we wasting our time with that thing? It's just a toy. Remember, a Macintosh in those days had a little black and white screen, and if you were a power user, you had 20 megabytes, all right? Wouldn't hold many photographs. But again, the leaders, it happened to be John and me at that time, said, no, our instincts say this is going to happen. And so after about 2 years, all of a sudden, boom, it took off. But you have to have that conviction, and you have to stick with it. We've been lucky because we made some very good calls. We also had a few products we introduced that we don't talk about anymore because they don't exist. But we didn't put a lot of money behind them, and fortunately, we found out early that they weren't going to have that property. It was the same problem, by the way, with Acrobat. But then it was the Photoshop people who were saying, why are you spending this money on Acrobat? Photoshop is the #1 selling graphics application in the world. Why would you waste your time? And again, John and I instinctively knew that it was cheaper to send digital paper and print it if you wanted to print it at the point of consumption. It was easier to store it. It was easier to retrieve it if it stayed digital. And that's why the way I always have thought about Acrobat is it's digital paper. And that has turned out to be an incredibly valuable asset to the company. But again, we had to make sure the antibodies didn't kill it.
What do you think it would take to increase research investments in the United States?
Because of my story about the ARPA thing, I don't think it would be as much as you think if it were done that way. What really has to happen in the United States is we need to increase revenue. There are two ways to increase revenue. One is to get the economy to superheat, build a lot of taxable, by current tax law, revenue, or to raise taxes. I don't believe that just cutting is going to work. When I look at a business and I think about investing in, if they're making their profits by cutting their costs, that's a bad investment. A good investment is a company who figures out how to leverage its investments in a way that will in the long term grow the business and keep investing in it. So I think the biggest challenge is not the money, it's the will. And everybody who runs for political office says they want to improve education until they get the office. Then they don't do a damn thing. Excuse me. My oldest son is a school teacher, so I'm very sensitive to this topic. You know, unless we're prepared to do that, things are going to continue in this direction. All the bright kids, except for the ones in this room, go off to Wall Street because it's the quick buck. That doesn't make anything that's productive.
One more question, Lenore?
So, as you know, we have incredible high-tech talent right here at this university and potential innovators. And we're attempting to create a high-tech infrastructure in this region. Can a startup high-tech companies live anyplace else in Silicon Valley?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, not a problem. In fact, to a certain extent, good investors are looking for those opportunities because to the extent there's, and there always is, competition for talent, that competition within the geographic region of Silicon Valley is very intense. And in fact, if we are, as a region, are not careful, all we do is move employees in a circle through all of the companies there. That's not a very productive thing to do. So no, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is having a great idea. Because of the internet and high bandwidth, you can be anywhere in the world. If Antarctica was a great place to recruit scientists, go to Antarctica, doesn't matter. So that isn't the issue. You do need to have an infrastructure of law firms and, things like that, and venture people who are prepared to get on a plane and get out of Silicon
Can
Valley.
we bring some of that venture here?
Oh, will I? No, I don't have any venture. Great. I thank you so much. It was great to be here.